Hello, everyone. My name is Kelly Jordan, and I am an Employer Services Manager here at Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities, which we refer to as OOD. Today, I am co-hosting with my colleague, Julie Wood, and we'd like to welcome you to today's webinar titled, How Simple Can Accessibility Be at Work? Julie, will you please introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Kelly. Hello, everyone. My name is Julie Wood, and I am OOD's Worksite Accessibility Specialist. I'm also an occupational therapist and a certified ADA coordinator. In my role, I provide education for employers that is focused on creating inclusive and accessible workplaces. This includes discussing the guidelines under Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. It includes identifying ideas to consider for reasonable accommodations and sharing best practices and guidance for making the workplace accessible.
Thank you, Julie. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that today's training comes with a helpful learner's guide, which can be accessed now through the link that is posted in the Q&A section here on Microsoft Teams. Just as a reminder, the information we share in these resources and during today's conversation is for educational purposes only and is not legal advice, but we do hope this information is helpful for you. Also, OOD does not endorse products, services, or vendors. However, we will share examples throughout the webinar to illustrate possible solutions and resources for reasonable accommodations. We will be stopping about halfway through today's presentation and again before we conclude to answer any questions. So please post your questions in the Q&A section at any time throughout the presentation so they're ready for us when we stop. Julie, would you like to address the accessibility practices we have included in today's webinar?
Sure. We plan for accessibility from the start. For example, we use the accessibility checker that is built into Microsoft 365 to review the learner's guide in PowerPoint. We address color contrast, font style and size, and add alternative text, known as alt text, to visual images. Also, in our delivery, Kelly and I mention each other by name as the conversation between us goes back and forth to indicate who is speaking. This can be helpful when attendees are receiving this information through services like American Sign Language interpretation and live captioning. After the webinar, we edit the transcript and fix any captioning errors before uploading the webinar to our on-demand library. We also include a reasonable accommodation statement in our invitation to the webinar, so if attendees need an accommodation, they know who to contact to ask. Taking these steps up front can make this presentation more accessible and inclusive for everyone.
Julie, today we are going to highlight the accessibility tools and strategies that may already exist in the workplace or could easily be added to provide accessibility for all employees, including employees with disabilities. I think today's information could be a great way for employers to identify changes they can quickly make in their environment that will be effective, inexpensive, and contribute to a culture where everyone feels included. What will today's webinar include?
Kelly, I think at times it can seem like creating accessibility is difficult to figure out or is expensive to implement. And while at times accessibility will take some problem solving and funding, often accessibility is simple and costs nothing at all. That's what the highlight of today's webinar is. We are going to focus on tools and best practices related to the digital and virtual environment, which will include a discussion about procuring technology that is accessible. We will also include ways to make meetings and events accessible, whether these are in person or in virtual spaces. And throughout the webinar, we will discuss the role all employees have in contributing to an accessible workplace and the options available for employers to incorporate training on and resources about accessibility to help inform their employees' efforts.
Julie, I'm sure employers are excited to hear how simple accessibility can be. Let's start with the employee's role and how they can make a difference.
Sure, Kelly. I often say accessibility touches everything we all do, which I know can sound overwhelming when we think of all the tasks and events that occur in the workplace. Employees are communicating, creating and sharing documents, participating in meetings, setting up work areas and event spaces, and creating new products and services. And maybe doing all of this in a hybrid fashion, meaning some of this is occurring in person while some of this is happening in the digital and virtual environment. So everyone has an opportunity to play a role in making the workplace as accessible as it can be. Fortunately, there are simple ways to get everyone thinking about accessibility and how they can remove barriers. Because of that, it is absolutely a best practice to empower employees to contribute to accessibility in their daily work.
Julie, that's a good point. I'd like to mention that OOD offers disability awareness training for employers, which our business relations specialists can present to all employees. Adding information about ways to make work accessible could be a great complement to this. What ideas and resources do you have for employers to share with staff?
Kelly, I recommend starting with information that focuses on what accessibility is, why accessibility matters, and the importance of inclusion in the workplace. To support this message, employers may consider a no-cost resource Microsoft offers called Accessibility Fundamentals. This is an online, self-paced training that includes an introduction to disability and accessibility, addresses what accessibility means, how to be respectful and inclusive of all people, and why it's important to make sure technology and materials are accessible to everyone. From there, emphasize to staff the importance of making accessibility a priority when planning events, creating documents, sending invitations, designing work areas, and starting new projects. This helps ensure accessibility is included from the beginning. Then it's helpful to provide some general education about common workplace barriers and ways these can be removed. For example, employees may set up a meeting room for colleagues to participate in a training presentation. So train them on how to make sure the room includes proper space for people with mobility devices to maneuver effectively. For those employees delivering the presentation, inform them of the importance of describing the visual content in the presentation for individuals who are blind or have low vision. Now, if identifying barriers and ways to remove them feels daunting, remember OOD can help. One way we can support employers is through the helpful fact sheets we create and post in the Inclusive Employer Toolkit on OOD's website. We have one called Accessible Communications in the Workplace that can be a helpful resource for employees who create new materials. This fact sheet includes tips for creating materials to be accessible to individuals with vision, hearing, and intellectual disabilities. We also offer worksite accessibility consults to employer partners for a customized approach. This includes working with OOD's worksite accessibility specialist who can help identify barriers in the workplace and provide resources and ideas to remove these. And I'd like to mention one more resource many of us already have that can be very helpful to share with employees to create accessible documents and forms. This is Microsoft's built-in accessibility checker for applications like Word, PowerPoint, and Outlook. We are going to discuss this tool in a bit more detail shortly.
Julie, I like how equipping employees with this information can spread the knowledge of accessibility across an organization. Instead of it being the responsibility of one person or one department, this empowers employees to keep accessibility in mind with all they do. That can really impact the culture of inclusion the employer is striving to create. You mentioned documents, forms, and the accessibility checker. So why don't we talk next about the digital environment?
Kelly, it's just as important to think of accessibility in the digital workspace as it is the physical environment, because so much of our work occurs here. No matter what kind of a job a person performs, they likely interact with the digital environment by using technology, attending a virtual meeting or interview, accessing training, creating and sharing electronic documents, and searching information on websites and intranets. Just like in the built environment, there can be barriers in these digital applications as well. For example, there may be visual content that is not described in words for individuals who are blind or have low vision and use screen reading software to receive information. Or there may be audio content that is not captioned. For example, many employers use training videos for onboarding or to communicate safety protocols. When these videos do not contain captions, an employee who is deaf or hard of hearing may miss out on receiving this important information. There can also be barriers in the way content is communicated when they include technical terms, jargon, acronyms, and words with more than one meaning without defining or describing these terms. One last barrier I'll share can occur when intranets and websites rely on navigating from page to page using a mouse instead of just keyboard commands. This can be a barrier for individuals with a variety of limitations.
Julie, what ideas do you have for employers to remove these barriers and create accessibility using tools they already have or could easily implement?
I mentioned Microsoft's Accessibility Checker earlier. Again, this is a free tool that is built into applications that many of us use, like Word, Excel, and PowerPoint. It can be used to identify accessibility barriers in these documents and offers instructional information and suggestions for fixing problems. For example, the accessibility checker will indicate when an image does not include alt text and when color contrast is hard to read. As I said in the introduction of today's webinar, we use the accessibility checker when we are creating our learner's guide and PowerPoint presentation for our webinars. In fact, I just leave this feature turned on so I always know the status of the accessibility of a document I am creating so I can make changes along the way. I also have this turned on in Outlook so I can catch any accessibility errors it detects before I send the email. For example, if you include a logo in your signature, the accessibility checker will alert you if alt text is missing. To know how to use the accessibility checker, Microsoft's support website includes a resource called Rules for the Accessibility Checker, which provides instruction on how to use this tool. It also explains that while the checker finds most accessibility barriers, there are some it can't detect, so it's important to manually review the document for additional barriers. So, for employers that have these applications and weren't aware of the accessibility checker, this is an accessibility tool you can start using today.
Julie, that's a simple first step that would be easy to take. Do you have some resources employers can share with their staff on how to create accessible documents from the start?
Kelly, I have a few resources to share, all that come with no cost. The first is an online training resource from Microsoft called Creating Accessible Content with Microsoft 365. This training addresses how to create accessible content in applications like Word, PowerPoint, Excel, and Outlook. This is a module within the Accessibility Fundamentals training I mentioned earlier. This module includes 7 units, is just under an hour long, and it can be taken 1 unit at a time. The second resource is from the Office of Accessibility on the State of Minnesota's IT Services website. This website provides a video on why accessibility matters, training on creating accessible documents in Word, PDF, PowerPoint, and Excel, and instruction on how to create accessible multimedia like videos, podcasts, and webinars.
Julie, these sound like great accessibility resources employers can offer to all employees. What about features like font style and color contrast?
Kelly, there are a couple of resources available at no cost from WebAIM, which stands for Web Accessibility in Mind, and it addresses fonts and color. The first is called Typefaces and Fonts. This resource addresses ways to improve the readability of fonts. For example, it discusses how complex fonts can be time-consuming and difficult to read, while using a simpler font can be easier to read. In the PowerPoint slide, under the heading of Typefaces and Fonts, we've included 2 examples of sentences written with very different typefaces of a font. The first one is complex and more difficult to read. The second is simpler and easier to read. This resource also addresses considerations for font size and making sure to have the right amount of contrast, because too little contrast can be difficult to read, while too much contrast can be fatiguing. Which leads to the second resource from WebAIM, their contrast checker. We included a screenshot from their website in the PowerPoint slide that shows how to use this tool, which includes entering the foreground and background colors using their 6-digit hex codes. Then the contrast checker provides a result of pass or fail for both normal text and large text according to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. This can be useful when you are creating documents like PowerPoint presentations with colors and graphics, or when you are creating directional signage in the workplace.
Julie, you've mentioned including written descriptions for visual content so individuals who are blind or have low vision have access to this meaningful information. Do you have any tips for writing these descriptions?
I do, Kelly. When content is created for the digital environment, it often includes visual representations to help convey meaning or organize information. These can include infographics, tables, images, and diagrams. While these are fine to include and helpful for some people, not all people receive information visually. People who are blind or have low vision may receive this information through screen reading software, which reads the information aloud or transmits the information to a braille display. So when visual content is present, it's important to remember to include alt text. There are resources available that share best practices and examples of alt text that employers could provide all employees. It's likely many employees create presentations and documents that include visual images, and so it's helpful to inform them of these best practices. This can help ensure individuals who use screen reading software can access the meaningful information the content conveys. Some tips include creating descriptions that are clear and concise, convey the meaning and purpose of the content, and that are generally no longer than a sentence or two. When visual content is not meaningful, you can opt to mark it decorative so a person using a screen reader is informed the image is not meaningful. We have an example of alt text in the next slide. In this slide, there is an image and next to it a box titled alt text that includes instructions and a written description of the image. This is a screenshot taken from the internet, but this is similar to how the alt text option looks in the accessibility checker in PowerPoint. There is some explanatory text to describe how to write alt text, like including details about the subject matter, the setting, the actions, and other relevant information, along with a tip to keep the alt text brief, like 1 to 2 sentences. The selected alt text for this image reads, "A person raising their hand in a meeting or training with several people in the background." At the bottom of the description is an option to have alt text automatically generated. I would recommend creating your own to ensure the alt text is accurate. Below that is an option to mark the image decorative. It would not be appropriate to select this option if the image is meaningful to the content. To the right of this example is a graphic of an arrow that is not meaningful to the delivery of the content. It's included for visual appeal. The alt text box option includes similar instructions for writing alt text and a space to enter a written description. But this time it's left blank because the option below this to mark the image as decorative is selected.
Julie, that's another great example of how simple accessibility can be at work. It's just a matter of being aware of the importance of conveying visual information in a written format, reviewing the best practices to learn how, and then prioritizing accessibility so alt text is included when visual content is created. And what about audio? Are there simple ways to make sure this content is accessible?
Kelly, information is often shared in the digital and virtual environment through an audio format like a video and a PowerPoint presentation, a podcast posted on a company intranet, and a conversation during a team meeting through a virtual platform. One way to make these accessible is to include captions. Captions are a text description of the audio content that are displayed on a screen. These can be open or closed. Open captions are automatically on and cannot be turned off. Closed captions have the option to be turned on or off. To inform employees of how to include captions in videos for PowerPoint presentations, Microsoft has a resource that addresses how to create a text file, how to mark the time when the captions should appear, and how to add captions to the video. Most virtual platforms used for meetings and events offer an option for closed captions to be turned on. Here in today's presentation, you can enable closed captioning by selecting the closed caption icon under the time bar, and then captioning will populate live on the screen. These captions are created through artificial intelligence, which is known as AI, and are not created by a live person. Because of that, you'll notice there are some errors. So while enabling captions can be helpful and make the presentation more accessible, there may be times providing live captions created by a trained stenographer is the best solution. Another way to make audio content accessible is to include a transcript, which is the written version of the audio content. This can be helpful for audio content like podcasts. To create a transcript, first download the text file from the platform being used, and then make sure to correct any errors before sharing the transcript. The kind of errors commonly found in transcripts generated through AI are with spelling, punctuation, sentence structure, and paragraphs. When you are correcting errors, it is also important to indicate in the transcript who is speaking if there is more than one presenter. So the simple solution for making audio content accessible is to become familiar with the technology you already have. These tools are a great starting point. It may just require keeping a few steps in mind, like learning how to turn on captions and how to correct errors in transcripts. And remember that at times, arranging for a trained stenographer to provide live captions is the best solution over using AI.
Julie, that's a fantastic point that employers likely already have this technology. What are some best practices for conveying information in an accessible way?
Kelly, when it comes to the way information is written, the best practice is to use plain language. This is language that is clear and concise, is organized, and is written for its intended audience. We included resources in the Learner's Guide with checklists for creating plain language, one that is specific to language used on websites. Some of these tips include organizing the information with useful headings, lists, and tables, using short sentences and pronouns like you, defining any technical terms that are used, and omitting any unnecessary words. Some tips specific to creating plain language for websites include to use even shorter paragraphs and more lists, using section headings that are descriptive, writing using the same words the reader would use to search for information, and avoid using the term "click here" as a link. Instead, embed the link in language that describes what the reader will obtain if they click the link. Employers may find it helpful to share these tips with all employees who create written content, so everyone is more mindful of creating material that is accessible for everyone.
Julie, I think it's common to see "click here" in website content. I think it would be helpful to share an example of how to write this in an accessible way.
That's a good idea, Kelly. So the tip is to avoid using "click here" to direct someone to select a link to connect to another web page or resource. We've included an example of what not to do and what to do in the PowerPoint slide. Instead of stating "click here to watch the webinar" with the link embedded in the words "click here," state this as "see upcoming and past employer webinars sorted by topic," with the link embedded in the words that describe what the link is connecting the user with. In this example, the link is embedded in the words "employer webinars." This description can be very helpful for individuals who use screen reading software and are quickly scanning a page for links to know what resource a link is referring to.
Julie, that's another simple accessibility tip that all employees could be informed to use. You mentioned a barrier earlier about an intranet designed in a way that requires users to use a mouse. Can you tell us more about why this isn't accessible and what the best practice is?
Kelly, websites and intranets that are designed to require using a mouse to navigate are not accessible to individuals who may have a limitation with using a mouse, like individuals who are blind, have low vision, or have fine motor conditions like arthritis. But websites and intranets can be designed for navigation using only a keyboard. So this is another example of how prioritizing accessibility from the start is a helpful way to approach new projects. There is a resource from the World Wide Web Consortium, known as W3C, which provides resources on how to design websites and intranets to be accessible using only a keyboard. It can be helpful to share this type of information with the professionals who design and make changes to functionality of these applications.
Julie, those are great tips and certainly helpful for employers who are considering simple ways to incorporate accessibility into the workplace. Now, before we shift away from the digital environment to ideas for in-person meetings and events, I know you wanted to share an idea with employers about buying accessible technology. I thought this webinar was about items employers already have or could easily implement.
It is, Kelly. Let me tell you how this idea fits. Employers periodically purchase items like information and communication technology. These technologies often have accessibility features and accessibility barriers. So, to create an accessible workplace, a simple best practice is to buy accessible technology when you are making the purchases you planned to buy anyway. This goes along with our theme of prioritizing accessibility from the start. It just requires incorporating accessibility into the procurement process. And I have some resources to help employers do this. The Partnership on Employment and Accessible Technology, which is known as PEAT, has a resource called Buy It. This includes steps for incorporating accessibility into the procurement process, like setting priorities for accessibility, evaluating proposals, testing for accessibility, and managing the accessibility performance of the technology. Disability In has an accessible technology procurement toolkit to help employers purchase technology and services that are accessible to people with disabilities. This toolkit addresses policies, why accessibility matters, ways to foster a culture that supports accessible procurement, and investigating accessibility. The final resource is from the Job Accommodation Network, known as JAN, and it's called Accessible Virtual Meeting Platform Resources, which lists several platforms and their accessibility components.
Julie, these resources seem like they could really help employers begin their journey with creating a plan to purchase accessible technology. Okay, I think it's a good time to take questions. Just so everyone is aware, we did receive some pre-submitted questions with the registration. I'd also like to give the employers attending today a chance to interact with us. Based on the accessibility tips Julie has provided so far in today's webinar, which of these do you think you can begin implementing fairly simply or are already using in your workplace? We'd love if you would share this with us by entering your answer into the Q&A box, and we'll read some of these during the break. The first question that we have today, Julie, is when we are making posts on social media, should we also be running the accessibility checker, or is there something different that we should use?
Thank you, Kelly, for that question. So that is absolutely a great question, and there are accessibility tips for social media posts. So thanks for bringing that up, because that's just one more aspect of the digital environment. If you're creating that post in a document that Microsoft 365 has before you put it into the social media, then you can use the accessibility checker. That is unique to Microsoft. So if you're making the post in the social media platform, you'll want to check that platform to see if it has some kind of an accessibility checker. I will say that I have seen resources for making sure that your social media posts are accessible. And so I can help connect you with those resources, because I'm not sure in our 1-hour webinar we've included everything in the digital environment, but I'm happy to connect you with some of those. If I can be helpful, just reach out with an email.
Thanks, Julie. And the next question we have is, do you have a guide on how to ensure it is on in these applications? And I believe they're referring to the accessibility checker.
Yeah, I agree. I think so too. And so when you turn it on in these applications, it stays on. And so I know I referenced the training from Microsoft that's online, no cost. You just kind of hop into the modules that talks about how to use the accessibility checker. If I look quickly at mine, I believe you go to the review tab, and then there's an icon in that bar at the top that says check accessibility. And if you hit the drop down arrow, there should be a way to enable it so that it stays on. And then you'll see at the bottom of your document the status of accessibility. It'll tell you if it's good to go. It'll tell you if you need to investigate. So I think if you look at kind of the ribbon above and the toolbar, you'll find how to get to that, but also that resource from Microsoft will be helpful in learning how to use the checker.
Okay, Julie, and one of the questions that was submitted with registration is how can we assess accessibility ahead of making an application?
So there's a few ways to consider doing that. Again, if you're creating that application in a Microsoft document before you upload it to the digital environment, you could use the accessibility checker, and then also some of the best practices from the resources that we shared on creating accessible documents to make sure it's accessible from the start. We also had a webinar, probably a year and a half ago on digital accessibility and accommodations in the workplace that provided some resources for testing your digital environment and your career page for accessibility. So that webinar is available in our Inclusive Employer Toolkit on the website, and through an email, I could also quickly connect you with those resources. It's a good idea to have your career web pages kind of maybe tested through using screen reading software. So employers sometimes take the step of approaching it through that lens. For our employer partners, we can navigate your career webpage through the use of JAWS, which is one of the more frequently used screen reading softwares, to let you know if from a candidate perspective who's applying for the job, there are any barriers that the screen reading software runs into, to let employers know what those are so that they can begin to work through those barriers. So employer partners are welcome to reach out to us to learn a little bit more about that service as well.
All right, Julie, and one other pre-submitted question. Is there any financial assistance available to an agency to upgrade the digital environment?
I don't know that there are incentives or funding specific to digital accessibility projects, but what some employers tell us they do when they are eligible for the tax incentives that are available to employers who hire individuals with disabilities and provide reasonable accommodations, they'll take the funds from those tax incentives and they'll apply it to a workplace accessibility and accommodations fund or budget that they've created, so that they have a budget for these types of projects in their workplace. We also encourage, aside from that employers do consider creating a fund for these types of things, because there are times that accessibility and accommodations do come with a cost. And if you plan ahead for that with some funding, then when these come up, you can use that fund for that project. And then, like we've mentioned already, just keep in mind when you're buying things that you're going to buy anyway, to remember accessibility when you make those purchases. So especially with technology, so much technology has accessibility built into it, but may not be foolproof. So it's helpful to investigate what you're going to buy to know what its accessibility components are, but also what its limitations might be, so you can be prepared for other ways to overcome those accessibility barriers.
Thank you, Julie. And we had a couple of employers share their accessibility tips. And one of them said, we use a logo on our email signature. I plan on ensuring it has alt text.
That's
and
fantastic.
Another employer shared a very quick and easy thing is the Microsoft Checker that I can share with my team to implement on a daily basis. So thank you for sharing those accessibility tips. Those are two very quick and easy things that you can implement right away. One final question did come in, Julie, and it's, are there any accessibility resources for the Canva program?
You know what, I imagine that there are. That's not something that I have researched before, but I would be happy to if you want to reach out to me so we can be connected. And then I can take a quick look to see what I can find there. But I imagine there would be some, but off the top of my head, I'm not familiar.
And one final tip, accessibility tip that came in from Rose in our audience, typefaces and fonts, alt text for images, and color contrast can be easily implemented. So thumbs up to that, Rose. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for your questions and for sharing the accessibility tips you plan to implement or already have. We are going to take another break before we finish, so please post any more questions that you have in the Q&A box. Okay, Julie, let's talk now about some best practices for making meetings and events accessible.
Sure, Kelly. We've talked a few times about how everyone has an opportunity to contribute to making the workplace accessible. Meetings and events are popular workplace activities, and they occur in person, virtually, and at times in a hybrid fashion. It can be helpful to inform employees about what they can do to make sure when they create events and meetings, deliver presentations, and facilitate interactive activities, they're doing so in an accessible way. So we are going to talk about what can be done before, during, and after meetings and events to make them accessible. Some of these ideas will apply to all environments, and some will be specific to whether the event is occurring in person, through a virtual platform, or a combination of both.
Julie, that sounds like a good approach. What are some simple accessibility tips employers can consider when they are planning meetings and events?
Kelly, we are probably never going to have a webinar where I don't mention the importance of a reasonable accommodation statement. I think this is the number one most important and simplest accessibility tip I can share with employers. This statement communicates the right to reasonable accommodation and includes contact information for making a request. We often reference one of the key areas to include this statement is in invitations to activities like interviews, presentations, meetings, and events. It's also important to include in registration forms, calendar invites, and confirmation emails. And it's important to include a description of the event with the statement so all individuals are informed and can decide whether they would like to request an accommodation. For example, include information about the accessibility features already being provided. Meaning, if you are providing live captioning through a trained stenographer for all attendees, which I've seen occur at large conferences, indicate that. You could also include information about accessible parking, entrances, and restrooms. It's also helpful to describe the environment, the event, and any activities planned. For example, if activities will include moving about the space and interacting with others, it's helpful for attendees to know this in advance. Another tip is to include a date to request a reasonable accommodation by, because some accommodations may take some time to coordinate, like sign language interpretation. However, if someone does make a request after the deadline, you do still want to make your best effort to provide the accommodation if you can. An example of a reasonable accommodation statement for an event or meeting from the Employer Assistance and Resource Network on Disability Inclusion, which is known as EARN, says, please request alternate formats, sign language interpreters, and other reasonable accommodations by at least 5 business days prior to the event. And then the statement provides contact information.
Julie, the reasonable accommodation statement is simple yet so important. Including this is one way employers can demonstrate their intention of being a disability inclusive workplace. What is important to know about the materials being prepared for the meeting or event?
Kelly, there are a variety of materials that support meetings and events, like promotional materials, registration information, agendas, and presentation materials. Another way to prioritize accessibility from the start is to make sure when you create these materials, they are accessible. I'll share a quick reminder of the tips we discussed earlier for making these materials accessible. First is to remember to use the accessibility checker that is built into the Microsoft 365 applications like Word and PowerPoint. Remember to use alt text, accessible fonts, and proper color contrast. Correct any captions and transcripts for audio content before these are shared, and use plain language that is clear and concise and free of jargon and technical terms. Following these principles from the start helps to make sure these materials are accessible to as many people as possible.
You know, Julie, one thing I've noticed that I think employers will appreciate is that one single accessibility concept can be applied in many ways. For example, alt text is one accessibility tool, but it can be applied to all visual content included in the digital environment. Next, we have some general tips for employers to consider when planning an event or meeting.
Yes, Kelly, there are some general items to keep in mind in the before phase. The first is to either provide materials related to the event in advance to all attendees or be prepared to if a request is made. Remember to build in time for short breaks for events and meetings that last more than an hour so individuals can manage any personal needs they have. For example, a person may need to take a break in a quiet area or need a break to take medication. Also, a person may need to care for their service animal and visit the facility's animal relief area. Another tip to consider during planning is to assign a person to be in charge of accessibility and technical needs during the event, and plan for a backup contact just in case the assigned person is unavailable on the day of the event. You may want to consider taking time to rehearse the accessibility components you will use during the event so you know how to use them and ways to troubleshoot obstacles that could arise. And the final tip is to provide those who will be speaking during the event with guidance on how to present in an accessible way so they are prepared ahead of time.
Julie, I know we are going to review some of the guidance for speakers a bit later in the webinar. Are there any simple tips you'd like to share with employers that are specific to preparing for meetings and events occurring in the virtual environment?
Kelly, I do have a few ideas to consider in the virtual environment. The first we've already talked about, but it's worth repeating, and that is to make sure the documents that accompany the virtual event are accessible. The next idea is to identify the accessibility features the virtual platform being used already has, like captions, and then become familiar with how to use these and how to instruct others to use these. For example, in our message that plays before the webinar starts, we inform attendees of how to turn on captions for the presentation. The final tip I have for preparing for a virtual event is to make sure to include an option where attendees can call into the event using a telephone.
Julie, that's a great point about becoming familiar with the accessibility features of the virtual platform being used and how to instruct others on how to use these. Now, what tips would you like to share specific to in-person and hybrid events?
Kelly, the first tip I have is for when a meeting or event is being hosted in an off-site location. It's important to select a location that is accessible. The employer may want to create a list of questions to ask about related to accessibility, like whether the facility has accessible parking, entrances, and restrooms, whether there is accessible signage in hallways, rooms, and at elevators, and whether there are animal relief areas and sensory rooms. For a hybrid event, make sure attendees in person and remote can all view live captioning and sign language interpretation if these are being provided. And make sure everyone can hear the presenters and the audience when they participate. I once attended a training as a remote attendee that was being delivered to a live audience as well. The presenter used a microphone, but they did not use a roving microphone for the audience members when they asked questions. The presenter did not repeat what was asked before answering, so that information was unclear to those of us attending remotely.
Julie, I think it's important to highlight the point you just made. Accessibility benefits all attendees, both with and without disabilities. You mentioned earlier a tip about rehearsing the accessibility features included in a meeting or event. I can see where that would be very helpful to do related to the tip you shared about making sure both the in-person and remote attendees can all view the captions or sign language interpretation being provided. Now let's talk about simple accessibility tips employers can consider during the meeting or event. I know we wanted to revisit the presenter guidelines we referenced earlier.
Yes, Kelly, these tips are helpful to share with presenters before an event so they're prepared to deliver an accessible presentation. I'll share a few best practices that apply to the in-person or virtual environment or both. Let's start with the presenter's introductory remarks. The first tip is to inform attendees of who to ask if they have a technical issue or encounter a barrier to accessibility. Another is to advise attendees to say their name before they speak. Next, it's important to establish a process for asking questions in more than one way. For in-person events, these can include raising a hand, calling out, standing, or nodding. In the virtual environment, this could include raising a virtual hand, unmuting and speaking, or entering a question into the chat. And a final tip for when the event is in the physical space is to remind attendees to keep the common pathways clear of obstacles like bags and chairs.
Julie, these tips also seem like a great way a presenter can model best practices for accessibility for others who may not have considered these ideas before. What about during the presentation?
Kelly, there are some simple ideas to keep in mind here. The first is to state your name each time you resume talking after a break. This can be helpful for sign language interpreters and stenographers providing captioning so they can indicate who is speaking in their delivery. Remember to face the audience when speaking. Attendees who speech read rely on seeing the presenter's face, expressions, and body movements to receive information. To this point, make sure to be positioned in an area with adequate lighting and avoid being in front of a window with natural light or in front of a busy background. Another best practice to consider in moderate to larger spaces is to use a microphone instead of asking whether everyone can hear you. Some people may have a limitation with hearing, but do not want to disclose this, and as a result, may not receive important information. Also, try to have a roving microphone for attendees to use when they are asking questions or making comments. And if this isn't possible, then make sure to repeat what was said so all attendees are informed. Now, when you are delivering information during the meeting or event, remember to speak to everyone in the same tone and at a normal rate. Speaking at a normal rate can be helpful for some people with disabilities, and it can help the professionals providing sign language interpretation and live captioning to provide these services accurately. One final tip I'll share is to make sure the presenter addresses all the points included on the slide. This doesn't mean the text has to be read verbatim. However, it's important to present all the meaningful content because if you skip certain items, attendees may miss important information. For example, some people may be receiving the presented information through services like live captioning or sign language interpretation, which convey only what is said. Attendees who are blind or have low vision may be relying on the auditory delivery of the content and have a limitation with seeing what was not addressed on the slide. When you are addressing the content, make sure to describe the meaningful visual content as well, like images, graphics, demonstrations, and activities that are a part of the event. So individuals who are blind or have low vision receive this meaningful information.
Julie, these really are simple accessibility tips to incorporate into the delivery of presentations, and I think it starts with the awareness of the importance of doing so. I think once presenters understand these practices, they'll be able to quickly implement them. Now, I know we have some specific ideas to share related to when a sign language interpreter is present, and also about using specific items during a presentation like markers and laser pointers.
Kelly, I have some key accessibility tips to share that are simple to implement. When sign language interpretation is being used, remember to speak directly to the person using interpretation, not the interpreter. Make sure to position the interpreter where they can be viewed best by those who are utilizing this service, and in front of a plain background to improve visual access to them. Then make sure the interpreter is ready before you begin speaking. If you are using markers during the presentation or for an activity, make sure to use markers that do not have added scents because some people have sensitivities to fragrances. Also, it's best to avoid using flashing and moving objects. These can be distracting or a trigger for a seizure. If laser pointers are being used, be mindful to not wave them around the screen.
Great, Julie. Let's talk now about some accessibility tips that are simple to include after a meeting or event has occurred.
Kelly, I do have a few ideas for this phase as well. If you send post-event communications, materials, or evaluations, make sure these are in accessible formats. If there are any recordings you plan to share, make sure things like transcripts and captions have been corrected first. If you send a follow-up evaluation or survey for feedback, add a question related to accessibility. This can help future presentations to be more accessible and inclusive.
Julie, I especially like the idea of adding an accessibility question to the follow-up evaluation. This can provide employers valuable information about what barriers they have in their process so they can work towards removing those and creating access to everyone attending their meetings and events. Now seems like a good time to share the new resource we've added to the employers page of OOD's website.
I agree, Kelly. Our employers page provides a lot of great information about our business relations team, on-demand webinars, no-cost services and resources, and includes the Inclusive Employer Toolkit. To help employers quickly find the resource they are looking for, we've added a feature called the Accessibility Alphabet, which provides a list of common terms related to reasonable accommodations, disability inclusion, and workplace accessibility. When an employer selects a term, a brief definition is provided with links to where more information on the topic can be found on OOD's website.
Julie, that does sound helpful. Thank you. Let's also share some exciting news about a new initiative OOD is working on related to accessibility.
Kelly, I am thrilled to announce that Governor DeWine's and Lieutenant Governor Husted's biennial executive budget for fiscal years 2024 and 2025 supports the creation of Accessible Ohio. The Accessible Ohio initiative will be a coordinated effort to support Ohio's cities, counties, state agencies, attractions, and venues to be accessible and inclusive. Similar to how we offer Worksite accessibility services to our employer partners, this initiative will allow us to provide consultation and education services to these public and private entities through Accessible Ohio specialists. These specialists will work directly with local partners to help identify barriers to access and establish goals for accessibility through customized consultations. Through Accessible Ohio, we will build on the governor's commitment to Ohioans with disabilities by fostering a sense of community and belonging that strengthens the state for all of us, including Ohioans with disabilities.
Julie, this proposed initiative in the governor's budget is very exciting and is an opportunity for Ohio to be a leader in creating public accessibility and fostering a culture of disability inclusion in all aspects of public life. Thank you for sharing. With that, let's take one final break to see what additional questions have come in. We do have another employer in the audience who uses Canva too. Another question we have is, I'm an employment specialist, wondering if any companies have or there are any positions already in place for people with disabilities who test their company's apps or etc. to see how accessible their websites are. I know that there are usually issues with JAWS, for instance.
Yeah, that's an interesting comment and would be a great resource to provide some testing using these technologies. You know, I know that the maker of JAWS, they have some people who do scripting and can do testing. And so there probably are some resources out there for this. Like I said, for the employer partners, we can provide the experience through the lens of applying to a job as a user or as a candidate and let you know if there's some barriers that we encounter through using things like JAWS. So great comment.
In your example of not hyperlinking, just click here, would it be okay to hyperlink the whole sentence? Click here to access webinars?
You know, I believe the best practice is to still keep it succinct and short and just to highlight what the actual resource is that you're going to be sent to when you click the link. And so if what you're going to be accessing are webinars, I think the best practice would be to embed the link in that word webinars.
Thank you, Julie. And one pre-submitted question was, how do you respond to an individual with a disability if they are attending a virtual or in-person event and they didn't request an accommodation but need one at that time?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that happens. I think we try to prevent that happening by including that reasonable accommodation statement in all those key areas that we mentioned and supporting that statement by describing the best you can the activities in the event, the space where the event is occurring, whether it's the virtual space or the physical built environment, advising on what you're already providing. That way people are as informed as they can be to know if they need an accommodation and would like to make that request. If it does happen that a person arrives to an event and needs an accommodation, that can happen in an interview, it can happen in a webinar, it can happen in an in-person training. Just do your best to talk with the person and find out if there's a solution that can be provided on the spot. There's times that's not going to be able to happen as easily. If a person arrives and may be requesting or needs sign language interpretation, you may or may not have access to that. You may have a list, database of sign language interpreters that you can call, and you would want to do that to see if you can coordinate it. There is video remote interpretation that could be considered, but really what somebody needs is always determined on a case-by-case basis. And so just to have the conversation in the moment, see if there's something that can be worked out that is effective. And again, just keep using that reasonable accommodation statement up front in a way to capture the needs of your audience or your attendees or employees ahead of time.
Great. And one final pre-submitted question, Julie. Are you allowed to ask a person if they need an accommodation, but they haven't requested one for a training or webinar or event, however they have in the past?
So I'm going to answer this question based on this being an employee that you're in this situation with. So there are times, generally speaking, the person who has the need for the accommodation asks for the accommodation, but there are times an employer can ask, and those times include when the person has a disability, which means the disability is either obvious or it's already been disclosed, which in this question, it's already been disclosed if they have a previous accommodation. And the second part of this is, as the employer, it needs to be that you reasonably think the person might need an accommodation. So when both of those are met, you can ask if a person needs something. So for example, if you're sending an employee to a conference out of state and it's the first time you've done this, and let's say the employee is deaf, that the person is reasonable to believe might need an accommodation to travel and attend an event in another state, that would be a time that an employer could ask the employee if they need accommodations and have that conversation.
Thank you, Julie. That's it for our submitted questions. I would like to point out that a link to our accessibility alphabet has been included in the Q&A chat, so please check that out. Thank you for your questions, and that brings us to the end of today's webinar. Julie, what closing thoughts do you have?
Kelly, we have talked about accessibility in a variety of our webinars for employers. We've highlighted many ideas and best practices in our digital accessibility and accommodations webinar. In our fourth session of our Inclusive Employer Handbook, we focused on strategies employers can use to foster an inclusive workplace for all employees related to accessibility. I wanted to approach things differently in this webinar. Today's goal was to showcase tools and strategies employers likely already have or could easily acquire to make the workplace more accessible. So we addressed the common aspects of the workplace we all likely find ourselves working in, including the digital environment and participating in meetings and events. And we shared the importance of informing or training all employees on why accessibility matters and the role they play in creating an accessible workplace, because accessibility is a part of everything we all do. There are many opportunities to lead with accessibility in mind, and I hope you all leave today's session with some simple ideas to move forward with. We appreciate your continued interest in our employer webinars and invite you to contact us if we can help in any way with your worksite accessibility and inclusion goals. Thank you to the fantastic webinar team that brings us all together, and to my co-host Kelly, it's always great to present with you. Thank you.